Welcome to the second lecture in this series on Elizabeth I's reign. In this lecture, we will be studying the extent to which the Elizabethan settlement of 1559 was successful. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we will examine the Protestant features of the Elizabethan settlement. Then we will study the Catholic features that were seen to balance out the Protestant features in order to create the middle way. We will then study significant acts of Parliament that were passed, including opposition from the Marian bishops in the House of Lords. Finally, we will then study the opposition Elizabeth received from both the House of Lords and House of Commons. Let's begin by examining a key definition for the term Elizabethan settlement. The term is used to describe the important pieces of legislation that were passed in Elizabeth's first Parliament of 1559 in order to settle the matter of religion. It outlined the doctrine and practices of the Anglican Church. Much of this remains unchanged to this day. The middle way is another phrase used to describe the Elizabethan settlement. This is because most historians see the Anglican Church as a compromise between Catholicism and Protestantism. This is because it kept some of the ceremonial aspects of the Catholic Mass whilst still following Protestant doctrine. By choosing the middle way, Elizabeth was able to satisfy moderate Protestants and Catholics. However, as we will see in upcoming lectures, this did not fully satisfy those who followed a more radical or strict doctrine, whether that be militant Catholics or the extreme Protestants known as Puritans. The Elizabethan settlement was largely founded on Calvinist doctrine. John Calvin was a French theologian and contemporary to Elizabeth. He had become incredibly influential across Northern Europe by providing the next wave of theological thought following the founding Lutheran principles of the Protestant faith. Essentially, you could consider Calvinism to be the second generation of Protestant thought. The founding principle of the Calvinist faith is that God reveals himself directly to the people through Scripture, and therefore an ordinary person does not a priest to act as an intermediary. Secondly, Calvinists believed that God had revealed himself through his Son Jesus Christ, and therefore people should not worship any other saints, including the Virgin Mary, but rather follow the teachings of the New Testament. Furthermore, mankind's salvation from sin can only be achieved through faith in God and Jesus, and not through an indefinite period of time in purgatory, or through paying the church for pardons. Finally, Calvinists were the first to believe in the concept of predestination. This is the belief that God is omniscient, and so despite mankind's free will, he knows whether someone will receive salvation to heaven before their birth. This would become a much more prominent belief later in Elizabeth's reign, adopted by the more radical Protestants known as Puritans. Elizabeth had received a Protestant and humanist education, partly due to the influence of her stepmother Catherine Parr. Throughout Mary's reign, she was refused to convert to the Catholic faith, and this is one of the reasons why she spent most of her sister's reign under house arrest at Hatfield House. Therefore, she was very determined to establish a church using Protestant principles. Despite this, there is also evidence to suggest that Elizabeth preferred a conservative form of worship, and like her father enjoyed the ceremonial aspects of the Catholic Mass. For example, she continued to support the famous choristers of Westminster, who sang in the choir for official royal services, and there is even portraiture showing her kneeling before what looks like an altar to receive the Eucharist. Therefore, it is fair to say that Elizabeth herself embodied the middle way intellectually. She was Protestant and believed in the founding principles of the Protestant faith, but when it came to her preferred style of worship, she was more Catholic. She was what we would call today High Anglican, enjoying a very similar style of worship as the royal family today. Despite Elizabeth's personal beliefs, she stated that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. What she meant by this is that she did not care for a man's individual moral conscience, only that they provided outward loyalty to the Elizabethan settlement by attending the Sunday services. In this sense, she wished to walk a much more tolerant and temperate road than her sister. Let's now examine the different Protestant features of the Elizabethan settlement. Firstly, and arguably most importantly, was the return to royal supremacy, so that Elizabeth, as the monarch, was head of the Church in England. However, she chose the title of Supreme Governor rather than head of the Church. This is partly because she was a woman, and so wished to appease those who believed a woman could not lead the national church, but also as a compromise to the Catholics. Elizabeth then introduced the 1559 Common Book of Prayer. This was the third version. The first was a moderate attempt by Somerset and Cranmer in 1549, and the second was a more radical attempt by Northumberland and Cranmer in 1552. Elizabeth's prayer book included most of the features from the first moderate prayer book, for example, the reintroduction of English services and clerical marriage. However, it did not include some of the more radical measures, like the removal of clerical vestments and the use of physical bread and wine on a communion table, that were introduced in 1552. The prayer book sought a compromise between the transubstantiation view of spiritual transformation of the Eucharist into the body and blood of Christ, and the consubstantiation view that the bread and wine was symbolic of Jesus' sacrifice. As part of the phrasing, the priest was to state that the congregation should eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee. This suggests that the Eucharist was a symbol of sacrifice. However, as a compromise is then added, feed on him in thine heart by faith and thanksgiving. This meant moderate Catholics could perceive this as an act of transubstantiation. Elizabeth did not support the marriage of clergy on a personal level, since she was naturally conservative in her views. However, she allowed clerical marriage, as she recognized this as an important feature of Protestant doctrine. In 1560, the Geneva Bible was published. This was written by a number of Protestant scholars who had fled Mary's Catholic regime and arrived in the Protestant city of Geneva in Switzerland. During Mary's reign, these scholars worked on providing a full and comprehensive translation of the Bible, with a particular focus on the New Testament. It was completed by 1557, and then available for mass printing from 1560. It became the first significant translation of the English Bible, and was much more widely read than the Matthew's Bible that was printed by Cromwell in 1539, but then restricted to just aristocrats through an Act of Parliament in 1544. The Geneva Bible was a very Protestant feature of the settlement, because it now meant that the literate members of Elizabethan society could now access the Bible in the vernacular language of English. However, let us not forget that a significant portion of the population remained illiterate, and so relied on the sermons of their parish priest to understand Scripture. Finally, the Elizabethan settlement banned key ceremonial aspects that Calvinists considered to come from the Catholic Church rather than directly from Scripture. These were known as superstitious practices. This included processions on saint days, pilgrimages to a local shrine of a saint, and the worship of miracles, which Calvinists condemned as being fake and part of the corrupt practice of gaining money for pardons. This meant that the colorful and mystical aspects of the Catholic faith were no longer celebrated. These had been the aspects that had been so popular across the localities during Mary's revival of the Catholic faith. Let's now examine the Catholic features of the Elizabethan settlement. Firstly, it is worth noting that it was visual and sensory aspects of the church service that mattered the most to Catholics. This includes ornamentation, incense, and stained glass windows alongside the use of choristers who would sing hymns. Unlike her brother, Elizabeth did not engage in a policy of iconoclasm involving whitewashing and plunder, which is why some Anglican churches still have ornamentation and stained glass windows today. Elizabeth also enjoyed choristers and would have them as part of her own private worship. However, she did not restore any of the beauty of the church that had been lost during Edward's reign. Firstly, it is important to remember that the church structure remained largely unchanged and remained in a strict hierarchy. There was and still is 2 archbishops, one of Canterbury and one of York. Bishops remained in charge of their diocese, with archdeacons and deacons below them. This meant the local parish priests remained at the bottom of this hierarchy. Later in Elizabeth's reign, this would cause controversy with a Puritan group called Presbyterians, who believed that there should be no bishops, since Jesus did not have a hierarchy amongst his disciples. Conservatives, on the other hand, would argue that Saint Peter was placed above the other disciples and this justified the hierarchy. As part of the Elizabethan settlement, priests were still required to wear vestments. These were ceremonial gowns that denoted the priest's role in the parish. They were controversial among the Puritans, who believed that any kind of special clothing was superstitious, and reinforced the old Catholic belief that the priest stood above the congregation and acted as the intermediary between the common people and the divine. One controversial aspect of the Elizabethan settlement was the black rubric. These are the words spoken by the priest accompanied by the action of kneeling in order to receive the Eucharist. The wording of the rubric explained that kneeling for communion was not an act of adoration for the Eucharist itself, but rather a gesture of reverence towards Christ. Essentially, the action was symbolic, not ritualistic. However, for Catholics, the action of kneeling accompanied by the elevation of the Eucharist by the priest meant that this important ceremony was maintained. This was enough to appease most modest Catholics, however, it did draw criticism from the Puritans, who believed it was a superstitious practice. According to Calvinist doctrine, a person receives salvation through faith alone. If taken to its natural conclusion, this would mean that a person's actions meant very little to their salvation. It was only through belief in God and Jesus Christ that you could enter the kingdom of heaven. This idea unnerved many Catholics, and so a compromise was struck, whereby the Anglican doctrine stated that good works were encouraged and adored by God. Essentially, a Christian who truly believes in the Scripture and teachings of Christ should wish to do charitable works in order to follow those teachings. Let's now examine the important legislation put in place as part of the Elizabethan settlement. The most crucial of these were passed in Elizabeth's first Parliament of 1559. First and foremost was the Act of Supremacy. This resumed the royal supremacy and once again broke ties with the Catholic Church. Instructions were sent to every parish in the country so that all churchmen had to swear loyalty to Elizabeth, and commissioners visited various parishes to ensure that this was being done, under threat of arrest if a churchman refused. Secondly, there is the 1559 Act of Uniformity. This was similar in nature to the 1549, and 1552 Acts of Edward's reign, since they were designed to ensure that practice was uniform, or the same across every parish in England. The 1559 Act of Uniformity affirmed that practices from the 1549 Act should be resumed, and thus excluding the more radical actions of the 1552 Act. Attendance at your local Anglican church was compulsory for all heads of household, and if they did not attend, then they could be fined. The death penalty was also introduced for any priest who conducted a Catholic Mass in public. However, this meant that many aristocratic families continued to attend the Catholic Mass in private, with the head of the household paying nominal obedience to the Anglican Church through attending Sunday services. The royal injunctions took place a few months after the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity, in July 1559. Royal injunctions are essentially decrees sent out by the Crown to the localities, which everyone must obey. There were 57 instructions in total. These included aspects that were Protestant-leaning, such as the ban on pilgrimages, but also conservative-leaning, such as instructions that no more altars or ornamentation should be destroyed. There was also an instruction that all priests should obtain a license for preaching, an indication that already there were Puritan ministers who were using their Sunday services to preach from the pulpit. The license was therefore a measure to control what was being said to ensure it fit with the official doctrine. The 39 Articles of Faith were not introduced until 1563. This is because it took 4 years for senior members of the clergy to construct a comprehensive blueprint for the Anglican Church. Whilst made public in 1563, it wasn't made law until 1571. The 39 Articles of Faith outlined the doctrine and practices that had already been implemented in Anglican services, such as the use of the Common Book of Prayer and the doctrine of salvation through faith. Significantly, they are still in use by the Anglican Church today, with very few changes made. Therefore, if you attend an Anglican service today, you will find that very little has changed in principle since the Elizabethan age. Finally, it is worth noting the Papal Bull of 1570. The term Papal Bull refers to a decree issued by the Pope and often relates to the excommunication of a nation from the Catholic Church. Henry VIII had received a Papal Bull in 1538 that officially excommunicated England, but this was reversed in 1554 as part of Mary's Catholic restoration. The 1570 Papal Bull of excommunication against Elizabeth was significant, because it was a clear order to English Catholics to both defy Elizabeth and to conspire in her deposition. This acted as a key turning point as militant Catholics acted upon the bull and began to conspire against Elizabeth to depose her and place Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. It then resulted in Elizabeth tightening up the laws against Catholic practice. Let's now examine the level of opposition that Elizabeth received in Parliament to the Elizabethan Settlement. We will examine the challenges that came from militant Catholics and Puritans in later lectures, so for now we will focus on this specific opposition at the start of Elizabeth's reign. These came from two key groups: firstly, the Marian bishops of the House of Lords, and secondly, from what has been dubbed the Puritan choir in the House of Commons. The House of Lords contains all the Lords Spiritual, in other words, the bishops of England. Most of the bishops had been in support of Mary's restoration of the Catholic faith, and so were expected to put up resistance against the Elizabethan settlement. In total, Elizabeth received opposition from approximately 20 Marian bishops. The bishops met in their own parliament-style meeting called Convocation in 1559, where they reaffirmed the papal supremacy and the Latin Mass. They then placed considerable pressure on Elizabeth to amend the first bills through Parliament. This is where the term Supreme Governor, as opposed to head of the Church, was introduced as a compromise. Despite this early resistance, the majority of bishops did accept the compromise, with relatively few choosing exile over the oath of supremacy. Traditional historian Sir John Neale coined the phrase Puritan choir to describe the resistance that Elizabeth received from radical Protestants. He takes evidence from a 1566 pamphlet that was signed by 43 MPs, who seemed to share the like-minded view that the Elizabethan settlement had not gone far enough. Initially, they wanted to introduce more features of the 1552 prayer book, and then as the decades went on, they made further demands to bring the Anglican Church more in line with other Protestant churches across Europe. However, most revisionist historians believe that Neale exaggerated the influence of the Puritan choir in these early days. Certainly, there was a group of MPs that became more vocal as Elizabeth's reign progressed, with Mary Queen of Scots and the succession being hot topics of debate. But this was not present during the crucial early years. As Elizabeth's reign progressed, she faced further pressure to reform the Church. Elizabeth overcame this opposition with her uncanny stubbornness. In Elizabeth's opinion, the settlement was settled and there was no further compromises to make. This helps to explain the long-term success of the settlement. The Church remained largely unchanged by Elizabeth's death in 1603, and James decided to take the same approach when he ascended the throne. The 17th century would then provide significant challenges, especially from the Puritans, but the Anglican Church nonetheless survived. This helps to explain why it remains one of the traditional aspects of English culture today. Let's return to our overarching question of how successful was the Elizabethan settlement of 1559. Firstly, we need to remember that the Elizabethan settlement provided a compromise between the needs and desires of both Protestants and Catholics in England. Nonetheless, Elizabeth established a Protestant change, shown through her title of Supreme Governor and her introduction of a common book of prayer and 39 articles of faith that set out Calvinist doctrine. Elizabeth knew that ceremonial aspects mattered greatly to the Catholics, and this is why she continued the use of certain traditions, such as the use of clerical vestments and permitting ornamentation on the altar. She also kept the wording of the Eucharist deliberately ambiguous, so that conservatives could interpret this as a ritual of transubstantiation. This appeased many of the moderate Catholics. It is also worth remembering that Elizabeth was able to pass important legislation in her first Parliament of 1559. These undid the changes of Mary's reign and firmly established the foundations of the Anglican Church, based on moderate principles, using the 1549 Common Book of Prayer as a blueprint. Nonetheless, Elizabeth did receive some opposition from both the Houses of Lords and Commons. From the Lords, this came from the conservative Marian bishops. From the Commons, this supposedly came from a Puritan choir that pushed for doctrine based on the 1552 prayer book. Nonetheless, Elizabeth remained resolute in her attitude, and this meant that the settlement did not change, and it certainly stood the test of time, since the Anglican Church of today continues to be based upon the 39 Articles of Faith of 1563. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next lecture to learn about the Puritan threat to the Elizabethan settlement.